Thank you, Trevor. So today is all about RegData, and I will go through the nuts and bolts, take a look under the hood, and explain how RegData is made, and also explain, hopefully, how it might be a resource for you. It's pretty easy to use, I think. But before I get there, let me set the stage for why this all matters and why you might be interested in using RegData. RegData was created to solve a problem, and this is the problem. That's the 2012 Code of Federal Regulations. If you stacked every page on top of each other, you'd have 24 feet of regulations. A person cannot read it all. If you tried to read all that on a full-time basis year-round, taking 2 weeks vacation, it'll take you about 3 years to read just the 2012 Code of Federal Regulations. So the question as an economist, or as people like you who are trying to understand what regulations' effects are, why you should be concerned about it, whether it's good or bad, what are the costs or benefits, well, you can't make sense of it all absent something like RegData, absent some sort of tool that can give you the comprehensive picture. Here's another way of looking at this. This is a phenomenon called regulatory accumulation. It is an important phenomenon that gets very little attention. The reason it gets little attention, in my opinion, is because it's hard to understand. It's hard to quantify. However, several executive orders and memos out of OMB have asked staffers at agencies, economists at agencies, to try to put a number on this. What is the cumulative effect of regulations? As regulations build up over time, which this graph is showing you, this is the number of pages published in the Code of Federal Regulations, which I will call the CFR. The CFR, each year from 1975 through 2012, we have growth from about 70,000 pages back in 1975 to over 175,000 pages now. In all of those pages, there's regulations that have costs and there are regulations that have benefits, but do they interact? Does piling one on top of another have some sort of effect that's different than what you see in the sort of regulatory impact analyses, the cost-benefit analyses that come out of agencies now that look at every individual regulation in isolation? That's sort of the question we had going into this and why we need to understand regulatory accumulation. Well, here's some results that we know, that we've started to understand about regulatory accumulation that I want to present to you first to let you know why it matters. For one, we've learned that less innovation leads to less growth. This is sort of obvious for anyone who understands a little bit of economics. Innovation is a driver of economic growth. Over the long term, it's the main driver of economic growth. Regulation can hinder innovation. Regulatory accumulation can hinder innovation, and by doing that can hinder economic growth. And we've seen this. There was a paper that was published by economists John Dawson and John Cedar, professors. This was published in the Journal of Economic Growth, that looked at what GDP would have been if regulations had stayed at the levels that they were in 1949 instead of accumulating from 1949 to the levels they were in the year 2011. So on the left-hand side is the actual GDP back in 2011 when they were doing their calculations, 15.1 trillion, and on the right, 53.9 trillion. That's what GDP could have been had all the innovation that was not realized because of regulation been realized. That's what they put into their model, and their model showed regulations growing over time. Something like this. This is what their model had. The red line is what we actually observed. That's the economy over time and how it grew. The blue line is what in their model the economy could have been had regulation been held lower, at lower levels. Now, what I want you to think about here is, how did they measure regulation? The model is details that we can worry about later if you want to, but the measurement of regulation is what's important here. You can look, again, as I said, at individual rules or at sets of rules, which probably everyone's familiar with that sort of study, but this was very novel because it looked at not individual rules or sets of rules, but at all rules, the accumulation of regulation, and treated that as a determinant of economic growth. So this shows you, if this model is right, and I think it's the best paper out there on this topic, that regulatory accumulation in and of itself is pretty important for long-run economic growth. It's also important, and this plays into the economic growth, for factors that determine, say, long-run outcomes for firms or for employees, for people in the economy. This is a graph from a paper written by Professor Anthony Davies. This paper used RegData, actually, to look at whether regulation affects labor productivity, how much stuff you get out of people working in firms. And there's three different sets of columns here. They all show very similar results. The blue column in each of these is the third least regulated sectors of the economy, and the red column in each of these is the third most regulated industries or sectors of the economy. On the left, you have output per person. How many widgets per person are being made? You can see that it's almost twice as high for the least regulated industries as the most regulated industries. Same for output per hour. And then on the right, you have unit labor costs. How much you have to pay in labor costs to produce one widget. And you can see, and you have the inverse here, similar results, but the red column is higher. It's because the most regulated industries, and the blue columns actually see unit labor costs go down over the time period examined, which was 1997 to 2010. So maybe this explains to some degree the previous results, right? The effect on GDP of regulatory accumulation. Because here's one specific part of it. If labor productivity is negatively affected by regulatory accumulation, then you would expect GDP growth to also be negatively affected. But this is only on the cost side, right? We can also try to look at, if we have a good quantification of regulation, we can look at whether regulation is producing benefits, whether it's doing what we think it should be doing when we make them to begin with. And that's what this study did. This is another study. This was written by Professor Courtney Collins. She looked at how regulation affects elementary and secondary schools. Over the period from 1960 through 2011, this is the budgets that was going from federal budgets to education, to elementary and secondary school. Yeah, the blue line is total outlays, and the yellow line is outlays per student. The takeaway here is clearly we're spending a lot more money on education. A lot more is being budgeted to education over this time period. Here is regulation of education taken from RegData. 1997 through 2012 is the years that she had data for, and again, the same sort of takeaway, clear growth of regulation of this sector. Now, you would expect, hopefully, with more money, more budget being devoted to this sector, with more regulation being devoted to this sector, that the outcomes in this sector that we care about are improving. If you took a look at that, here are average math scores. The top graph is average math scores from 1978 through 2012. It's a flat line. They're not going up. That's for three different age groups, age 17, age 13, and age 9. On the bottom is average reading scores. Again, it's a flat line for those three different age groups. So she did try to look at benefits and found that neither the budgetary increases or the regulatory increases are at least showing any sort of correlation that we'd expect to see. We don't even see a correlation. We're not going to be able to get into a causal inference. So there's some applications of quantifications of regulation. This is why we need to look at things like regulatory accumulation and understand it all. So, given that I'm not going to read for 3 years piles of regulations, the question is, what can you do to make sense of that big stack of regulations, and not just for 2012, but regulations published in 2011, 2010, all of those stacks of paper that were unique to each year. Any guess what WWGD stands for? What would something do? What would Google do? That was the answer here. How would Google make sense of all those stacks of paper? And now we're going to get into the sort of the nuts and bolts, how RegData was made, how it runs, and there might be some details that go too far into it. I'm happy to field questions about some details after the whole talk is done. But then at the end of explaining how RegData is made and how it runs, I am going to also go through some examples of how you can use it. So the basic task here was, if you think back to the stack of paper that you saw, that picture of me next to the stack of paper, if you think of each piece of paper maybe as a regulation, the task here is classifying each of those pieces of paper. What are those pieces of paper about? In the same way that Google reads everything on the internet and classifies what websites are about. That way, when you put in some subject into your Google search, it can give you a list of, here's some websites that are about the subject that you Googled about. That's the task here, basically. I've done this in two ways. The first way was with the human-assisted algorithm, which I'll explain. That was what you've seen in RegData 1 and RegData 2.0. RegData 2.1, which is going to be released later on this month, is actually using a new set of algorithms, some machine learning-based algorithms, which I'll also explain at a very high altitude level. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on it. So first, the human-assisted algorithm. Some of you who have already seen RegData may be familiar somewhat with this part of it. The human-assisted algorithm basically consisted of two steps. First, coming up with a set of search terms, devising a set of search terms for each subject that we wanted to classify documents into. So again, thinking back to websites, if Google was saying, we want to classify all websites into a certain number of subjects, that would be the same kind of task. Here, the subjects are the sectors of the economy. That's what we're trying to classify all the documents, all the regulations into. And so we devise search terms that relate to each sector of the economy, and I'll explain how we devise those momentarily. And then once we've done that, we can classify the documents, classify regulations based on the frequency of those search terms in the actual documents, in the actual regulations. Now, I don't think the idea of relying on search terms is insane, and let me show you why. Here is a table. This is showing you the most frequent words in Title 30, which is called Mineral Resources, Title 30 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Think of it as a bunch of books. Title 30 is like a book, basically. So in that book, in Title 30, if you look at the most frequent words, if you don't count the and an or the articles or prepositions, just count the verbs and the nouns and the adjectives, the most frequent word actually is shall, but then fifth on the list is mining and then coal and mine. And so if you didn't even know that this is called mineral resources and you looked at the most frequent words, there's a good chance you're going to guess that this book is about mineral resources or mining, right? Just by the fact that mining and coal are mentioned there. So that tells you that there's something to looking for words, looking for keywords, and the whole methodology here has some logic behind it. Now, here's how we came up with the keywords. This is a sample of descriptions of sectors in the economy, of industries in the economy, taken from the North American Industry Classification System. It's a way that economists have of dividing up the economy into different groups, different sectors. This is done at the 3-digit level. The 3-digit level is sort of somewhere in the middle in terms of how granular the divisions are. The 2-digit level is less granular. It's more broad definitions, such as manufacturing or construction. Here we have, at the 3-digit level, instead of just manufacturing, stuff like paper manufacturing or construction of buildings. So more granular definitions. Well, these descriptions, these definitions, give us some words that we can use. They give us the basis on which to create search terms. And so we have an algorithm that takes these descriptions, each of these descriptions, and there's hundreds of these, and then creates permutations of each of these descriptions, other sets of words, search terms, if you will. And here's a simplified example of how the algorithm works. Take this description, paper manufacturing, and then create these two permutations, amongst others, paper manufacturer, paper manufacturers. And so then for every single sector of the economy, we now have a set of search terms that we can search through every single document and see how frequently they occur. When they occur more frequently, we have a notion that that document is probably about the subject that we're searching on. So here's some results from that sort of method. If you take some 2-digit industries, so here's some very broadly defined industries, mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction is at the top there. This is the most commonly found search terms. That industry, mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction, has the most search terms found of any industry. And second, transportation. Third, manufacturing. Fourth, finance and insurance. So this is sort of a sanity check. If we looked at this and we saw, I don't know, something like secretarial services at the top, then we might worry about this. But instead, this isn't shattering any of my expectations. This makes some sense to me as someone who's studied regulation for a long time. So that's sort of one takeaway from this. Looking for search terms does match our prior expectations to some degree, and that validates it to some degree. Unfortunately, there's no gold standard to compare this to. This is the one and only industry-specific quantification of regulation over time. So that sort of test, that sort of validation method is about all we can do. That and see how it performs as a determinative of things like labor productivity, which I showed you earlier. So that's the search term method, the human-assisted algorithm. The second method is in development as we speak. Actually, it's mostly done and will be released with RegData 2.1, and that depends on some machine learning algorithms. So I explained earlier how we create those permutations of industry descriptions, and we have a set of rules that we follow, but those rules were ultimately devised by me and my co-creator. And maybe they're not right, maybe they're not perfect, maybe we get false positives. Instead, we can rely on computer programs to help us do some classification. And again, think back to, I didn't load very well, think back to the task here. Those are all books. Those are all books of this Code of Federal Regulations, and actually the stack goes way down to here. We're trying to classify each of those books, or maybe you can divide those books into pages, classify each of those pages. In fact, the average year, you have 8,100 sets of documents that we're trying to classify. The unit of analysis here, for those who really care about the details, is a CFR part. That's the same sort of thing as you see in law when there's sections and parts and titles. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at every CFR part and trying to classify every CFR part. So the way we do this with machine learning algorithms is first we train a program to do this classification for us. And then second, once that program's learned how to do the classification, we set it to work on all those books and have it spit out some numbers. Similar sort of logic as taking a set of search terms and looking through each book for the search terms, except in this case, we're not relying on human-defined sets. And then finally, once that's done, once we've done the analysis, then we can create a set of probabilities. And again, think back to the search term thing. If we find more search terms in a regulation, it's more probable that that regulation is about the subject that the search terms were created about. Same sort of thing here. We can assign probabilities for every CFR part for every year, for every industry. So here's what we relied on for our training documents. You're all familiar, I think, probably with the Federal Register. The Federal Register is published daily. It'll announce regulatory actions. It will have some content that goes into the CFR, but it has a lot of other content as well. The preamble, for example, on a proposed rule will go into the detail of a regulation without actually using much of the regulatory text in and of itself. In short, there's a lot of other text related to regulation that uses a similar language that also, by way of the small business regulatory flexibility analysis contained in the Federal Register notices for regulations, tells us the exact industry that's being affected by the regulation. It's very handy. So we can go through the Federal Register, gather thousands and thousands of these notices and proposed rules, final rules, and look for the industry codes, industry names, the exact names of those documents. And then once we have that, we've got at our disposal what's called a set of training documents. We can use all of these documents that we know, for example, that are about hospitals or about ambulatory healthcare services. We know they're about that, so we can use that to train our program to look for other documents that are also about hospitals or ambulatory healthcare services, walk-in clinics. All right, so that's the task. We want to train the program to look for these similar documents. Once we've done that, each CFR unit, as I said earlier, receives then CFR unit. Each CFR part receives a probability for each industry, and then we can treat that probability as the probability the part is targeting an industry. Now I want to clarify one thing here. What we're measuring with RegData is targeting of industries. There's going to be regulations that are more general, that affect everyone, all industries or all people. We're not capturing that, at least not with the industry-specific portion of RegData. There's other portions of RegData that could capture that, but this is all measuring when a document's about a specific industry. For those who have done any work in sort of risk assessment or risk analysis, which at its heart, regulation is about risk, it's about addressing risks, you can think of this as a sort of probabilistic risk assessment exercise, where if you think of the end user, the people being affected by regulations, whether that's businesses or people in the economy, you have this huge set of regulations, and there's some risk that those regulations will affect what you do, your business or your home purchasing. And that risk is a function of the probability that any piece of paper, any regulation is affecting your business. And then if that probability is really high, then what's that mean? Just because it's affecting your business, that may mean nothing if that regulation doesn't actually have any teeth to it. So the other part of it is, what's the severity of that regulation? So again, think of a regulation as a book. What's the chances that book affects me? And if it does affect me, what does that do to my day-to-day operations? What's the severity of that affecting me? That's a sort of probabilistic risk assessment way of thinking about regulation, and RegData is very handy for thinking about regulation in that way. Now, it's the only equation I'll show you, I promise. All right, so there's a few different ways you could measure severity, and the most basic one is probably the variable from RegData that you may already be familiar with, and that is restrictions. This used to be what when I presented RegData in the past, this would be the first thing I would talk about, the restriction count. But I've learned since that people tend to focus on that, I think, a bit too much. Restrictions are important. Restrictions are words like shall or must or may not or prohibited or required. It's not a comprehensive set of restrictions, but what we're trying to measure is how much a document is actually binding the set of actions, constraining the set of actions that a person or a firm could take. And so that's why we're looking for these words, these shalls and these musts. Turns out restrictions are actually pretty highly correlated with overall word counts. You could also look at word counts. It gets you fairly similar results. Either way, you can multiply the probability that a document's about your business or your industry that you care about, multiply it by restrictions or by word counts if you're thinking back to that probabilistic risk assessment model. Or you could ignore the severity part altogether. That's fine. That works pretty well too if you just take the probabilities and assume that severity is 1. So if a document's more likely to affect you, that means it's of consequence. That alone does pretty well as a sort of variable in economic analysis, or as a way of just trying to understand the lay of the land, understand how much regulation has been created about a specific sector or from a specific agency. All right, so now's the part where I get into how you can use it, some of the lessons that we learned so far, some takeaways that might be useful to you. So various ways of slicing the data. One way is you can look at agencies. So we can break this down. Remember all those books that I showed you, or all those pages? You can break those down into the books that are created by EPA, or the books that are created by the Office of Air within EPA, or by IRS or OSHA. So this is the top 10 regulators, and we're looking not at the department level, but at the agency level. So inside the EPA, we have Office of Air. Inside Treasury, we have IRS. Inside DHS, we have Coast Guard. I had to think for a second because it used to be DOT. OSHA, etc. This is the top 10 regulators in the year 2012 and how they changed from 10 years before. So EPA, Office of Air, by far the biggest printer of restrictions in the CFR. And you can see it's grown tremendously over the decade, especially compared to the growth rate of all these other agencies. So that's one way to slice things. Where have we been in terms of how much regulation agencies have created, and how has that changed over time? How has the rates of production changed over time? We can also look at agencies and how agencies respond to specific acts of Congress. So here is the Commodity Futures Trade Commission, CFTC, which was one of the regulators most affected by Dodd-Frank. They were instructed to create a lot of regulations. And here's two different ways of looking at it. We have the bars, which is just the total words, just the words printed by the CFTC. That black line there is 2010. That's when Dodd-Frank was passed, of course. And you see that the word count surged dramatically afterwards, as you would expect if Dodd-Frank was indeed a big deal and instructed CFTC to make a lot of rules. Similarly, the black line shows you a surge after 2010. That black line is the search term count for a specific industry. It's for financial, you can see on the right-hand axis there, it's the financial industry search term count. So this is perhaps a validation exercise. This is perhaps a way of assessing what Dodd-Frank did to CFTC. Clearly, the takeaway here is CFTC responded in a very large way to Dodd-Frank, and they responded in a targeted way by writing regulations about the financial industry. There's more Dodd-Frank stuff. You can look across a bunch of different agencies. In fact, this is showing you all of the agencies that were instructed by some part of Dodd-Frank to do something, aggregating them all together. The list is down here. I'll read it off to you. The agencies shown here include the CFTC, the Department of the Treasury, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Department of State, Federal Housing Finance Agency, Department of Housing and Urban Development, the FTC, the FDIC, the SEC, the National Credit Union Association, and the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection and the Financial Stability Oversight Council. So there's a lot of agencies, but this is something you can do. You can take any set of agencies and you can aggregate them. You can put them all together with our website on RegData. So whatever agencies you're concerned about, maybe you work on a committee and you have oversight of a set of agencies, you can aggregate them together and you can look at some statistics over time, which is all this is doing. We have word count, which is the green line, and we have restriction count, which is the blue line, over time, aggregated across all these. And again, we see in 2010 there was Dodd-Frank. Regulations take a little time to develop. So we see the surge reaction to Dodd-Frank start in 2011, go through 2012. So that's another way to look at this. Both of those are sorts of big picture assessments. You can do a lot more big picture assessments for specific industries. So each part that we were assessing, remember that we're classifying different documents, different CFR parts. If you think back to the nuts and bolts portion of this, we're giving each part a specific number for every single industry. But then we can sum all that across all of the books that we publish in the Federal Register. And that gets us to a bunch of industry-specific measures, which I'm going to show you next. So some industry-specific measures, you already saw the search term count one with the CFTC and the financial industry graph. We also have search terms times severity, whether that's restrictions or words, or the new version will be the machine learning-based probability times the severity. These are all different industry-specific measurements that we can sum across all regulations or across regulations within a set of industries and look at how that industry has been affected over time. So here's an example from a world that I used to operate in for railroads. This is with the new data. This is with RegData 2.1, which goes back farther in time. We used to only be able to go back to 1997 because the government printing office only made digital copies of the CFR available back to 1997. We found a way around that. Now we're going all the way back to about 1975. The black line there is the railroad-specific regulation index. It's the probability of each part being targeting a railroad multiplied by the severity of each part, summed across all parts. That gives us the Railroad Regulation Index. And this is interesting because railroads, it's one of those industries where we had some episodes of deregulation. We had the Staggers Act back in 1981, 80 or 81. Staggers Act deregulated railroads when it was passed in 1980. And it took about 5 years for regulators to take action on all the deregulation of railroads that occurred. And so what we'd expect to see if RegData is doing a good job measuring regulation is a decrease in regulation of railroads. And that red area there is the 5 years from the passage of Staggers Act to the final regulatory action that was implementing the Staggers Act. And you do see a decrease in regulation, the regulation index for railroads in that time period there. And then later on in 1995, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which doesn't exist now, was terminated with the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act. And again, we would expect to see as the text of that agency is eliminated, the remaining powers were transferred to the Surface Transportation Board. We'd expect to see some deregulation show up here, and we do once again. So this is the Railroad Index, and it shows you some good measurements of deregulation over some time period. I'm going to show you a lot more pictures of other industries, but first let me run through the various statistics that you can get if you go to regdata.org. You can easily pull this up, And the pictures I'm going to show you from here forward, these were all produced from the website and about 10 minutes of work last night. So it's pretty easy for you to do. What you can do is restrictions. You can get word counts. You can get search term counts for specific industries at the 2-digit, 3-digit, or 4-digit level. Years are 1997 through 2012. Oh, you also have the regulation index, which is actually the default graph, what it shows you. And again, that's the search term times restrictions. And you can get this for specific agencies or for all agencies together, or you can group sets of agencies together. And then RegData 2.1 coming later this month will have, instead of search term counts, some machine learning based probabilities. Oh, this is actually pretty important. You might like this. We're now associating all regulations with the underlying statute, with the act of Congress that caused the regulator to make it. So you'll be able to, with RegData 2.1, say, pick Dodd-Frank. Take Dodd-Frank and look at how many CFR parts were created by Dodd-Frank, how many new restrictions were created by Dodd-Frank, and in which agencies. So there's going to be a mapping of regulation to the impetus, to the legislation in RegData 2.1. So that's going to be I think, a pretty big breakthrough. And then we're going farther back in time, all the way back to 1975. All right, here's what you can do with RegData. You can look at some agency trends, industry trends. You can combine agencies and industries. And here's some examples. Again, I put this together last night. This is the Department of Labor, all the agencies within Department of Labor, and just the total word count over time. So it's a very broad picture, seeing probably what you expect. Over time, the Department of Labor has made more and more regulations, so we see the word count going up from 1997 to 2012. But we can zoom in on agencies within Department of Labor. So here's OSHA, that's in Department of Labor. And you see some variance. When you zoom in on agencies, you can see a different picture. You can see how the components of agencies may move different, components of a department may move differently than the department overall. So interestingly, there's actually some elimination of text in the late 1990s. You see that in a lot of agencies, actually. Late 1990s, 1997, 1998, for whatever reason. Perhaps it was the Reinventing Government initiative pushed by Al Gore. But there was some text that was removed from the CFR in the late 90s. But then you see reversion to perhaps the trend overall, which is growth. And you see some pretty spectacular growth in the last few years. Here is a specific industry. You saw the numbers earlier for mining, quarrying, oil and gas, the industry that has the most search terms mentioned. Again, we had some stuff eliminated in the late 1990s, but then going back to a long run growth, pretty much across industries we see a long run trend, long run growth trend in a bunch of different industries. And then a lot of them we do see some changes, 2010, 2011, some more rapid growth in a lot of industries. And maybe you want to know where that's from. This is showing you the regulation index as calculated by looking at regulations of all agencies. But we can zoom in. We can take a look at just EPA. So here's mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction, regulations by EPA alone. And you see maybe there's some different policies going into place in the late aughts, early teens, 2009 through 2012, a bit of a change in the growth rates. Here is another agency specifically looking at a specific industry, OSHA regulation of manufacturing. Similar sort of trend, right? Some late 1990s removal of text. This is the growth in the regulation index relative to what it was in 1997. I should have clarified that earlier. That's what's showing on the y-axis here. It's the percent growth relative to what it was in 1997 of the regulation index. So at the end of the day, there was some text removed, but then we go back to this trend and then some rapid growth in 2010 of OSHA regulation of the manufacturing sector. Go back to my old world, the FRA, Federal Railroad Administration. This one's interesting to me, surprising to me. One of the things that RegData surprised me with was I learned that railroads are mentioned more by the Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration than the Federal Railroad Administration itself. That's what this is showing you. The black line there is PHMSA, the Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Association, is measuring the number of times we found railroad-related search terms over time. And the blue line is the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, which They've both been growing over time, but amazingly, PHMSA has more mentions of railroads. Didn't know that. PHMSA makes the tank car rules, which maybe you're familiar with, so that might be why, amongst other reasons. PHMSA actually is sort of unique. There's a zoom in of PHMSA restrictions alone. This is just showing you the growth in shalls and musts over time. PHMSA stands out for growing pretty rapidly over the time period. It's one of the agencies that's grown relatively quickly compared to other agencies. So that's something else you can look at, just trends across agencies. What's the growth rate? Have some grown faster than others? And what's the reason for that? Well, with RegData 2.1, we'll actually be able to put a finger on the reason for that, because we'll be able to point to legislation, if there's new legislation. If there's not, if they're still acting on the organic legislation, that's interesting as well. And then finally, I'll take a look at Department of Treasury, especially with tax day coming up. So IRS is in Department of Treasury amongst other offices, amongst other agencies. And here's an interesting thing. We saw in a bunch of the earlier graphs some downward trends in the late 1990s. We didn't see anywhere a downward trend in the early 2000s like we have here. So what's going on? You can actually figure out what's going on with RegData. We can zoom in on the components of the Department of Treasury. And here's a breakdown. Unfortunately, the export function, so I made all these graphs again with the website and just exported the graphs and saved them. The export doesn't save the key of which is which. So there's, I guess, 5 different lines here. Each of the lines is an office within the Department of Treasury. The one at the top there is IRS. The green line, though, that's Customs, right? U.S. Customs Border Inspection. That used to be housed in the Department of Treasury. And then when DHS was created, it was moved over to DHS. So it turns out there wasn't deregulation going on here. It was just the movement of text from one agency's section of the CFR to another agency's section of the CFR. So that explains that dip that you saw right there. So you can dig in, you can see why you see some trends. So I'll leave you with that, because that's a pretty good, I think, assessment of how you can use this in different ways. Again, you can look at agency trends or departments and the agencies within departments. You can look at industry trends, and you can combine industries with an agency or with sets of agencies, and you can see all these different things interact, how they respond to legislation, et cetera. So it's all available on regdata.org. I'd be happy to take email questions if you have any questions about how to use this or what it means. You can also find me on Twitter. Occasionally we also tweet out some figures from RegData, especially with the new RegData. We'll be tweeting that out, so if you follow things on Twitter, you might follow me or the RegData account itself. And now we have some time as well for questions. I think we have 10 minutes or so. Any questions now?